Welcome to Spirit's Journey, coming to you live on Truth Frequency Radio and simulcast on Oneness Talk Radio. Your hosts are Patrick and Catherine Andrews.
Join us each week as we explore a wide range of metaphysical topics such as dreams, astrology, intuitive readings, and life purpose. You'll receive practical guidance so that you can live your most awesome life.
Learn more about what we do at intuitiveschool.com and connect with us on Facebook at Spirit's Journey Radio. Welcome to Spirit's Journey. We are coming to you on Truth Frequency Radio, simulcast on Oneness Talk Radio, iHeart, TuneIn, TalkStream Live, among others. We're here in the Heartland, holding the energy for spiritual truth and awareness. I'm Patrick.
And I'm Catherine. Welcome, everyone. So we all know the importance of exercise, particularly mind-body exercises. And today I'm so excited to present Bill Douglas, who is an award-winning author of The Gospel of Science, mind-blowing new science on ancient truths to heal our stress, lives, and planet. I can't think of a more needed book today, Bill. He's also a best-selling Tai Chi book, The Complete Idiot's Guide to Tai Chi and Qigong, and awakening fiction and nonfiction, including The Tao of Tai Chi, The Making of a New Science. Bill is the founder of World Tai Chi Day, a global health education project celebrated in over 80 countries and officially proclaimed or supported by government bodies around the world. Bill was inducted into the World Internal Arts Hall of Fame in New York in 2009. He's been a Tai Chi and mind-body source for media. You may have seen him on places such as the New York Times, the South China Morning Post, BBC World Radio, and on and on. So welcome, Bill.
Hey, Bill.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so honored to be here. Thanks for having me.
You're most welcome. Well, I'm really excited to get to talk to you a little bit today because you share a passion with me, which is really finding this blend of science and spirituality. My background's in metaphysics, and that's kind of where I started out, but then I started moving more and more into like physics and biology. And so now that's kind of my three areas of focus. And so it's really, I figured physics and biology, physics is the study of energy and biology is the study of life. So I thought those went really well with the intuitive sciences and metaphysics. And so I'm really excited to be able to talk to you about your take on that, because there's a lot of things here. And so your book, The Gospel of Science, sounds amazing. And in there, you talk about a path to global transformation. Now, that's a pretty big topic, and I know it's something that's pretty hot right now. So can you talk a little bit about your take on global transformation?
Yeah, well, it's interesting here and your interests, because excuse me, they align so well with this book. And one of the things that we're starting to see is kind of the lines between what we think of as spirituality, and I'm not talking about dogmatic religious practices, but kind of a spiritual consciousness the lines are starting to blur between that and science. And so my book grew out of that. I've been staying abreast of the breaking science on mind-body practices and consciousness and quantum physics and chaos mathematics and these things, because I've been trying to kind of understand this journey that I've been on and that I found out that really the whole planet's on. And so there's three basic, my book covers a lot of ground, and it's 600 pages of collected science and data, but to kind of give you a general grasp of the thrust of the book is that what science has discovered over the last decades is that compassion and empathy are the most effective, efficient, and economical solutions to all of our problems, whether it's physical health problems, mental, emotional issues, or social or economic issues on a macro scale. And the book also covers the science that shows that mind-body practices, meditative practices, have the ability to increase the empathy and compassion parts of the brain, to make meditators more empathetic and compassionate and feeling more connected to other people. And then the crowning aspect of the book is that if you look at the science, mind-body practices should be a core of public education, because they increase the IQ of practitioners. The research shows that students that practice meditation are more likely to score better on tests in school than non-meditating students. Like in the case of meditation and Tai Chi, for example, they've been shown to dramatically reduce the symptoms of attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, which is a big deal with schools and students. And then also they improve the behavior rates and the scholastic performance in schools that have adopted meditation and mind-body practice programs as part of their education. They've seen improved behavior rates, less bullying, all these kind of things. So it's really, with the science, it's really a no-brainer. These things should already be part of public education worldwide. But if we can, get information to educators around the planet, and they can start incorporating mind-body practices, then a side effect of that is that the empathy and compassion parts of the meditators' brains are expanding, and the fear and stress parts of the brain are shrinking. And so that's a huge thing, because if, as we get these things into public education worldwide, in 18 years, we could very literally create an entire generation of mind-body masters, which would not just save us massive amounts of money and saved health costs, future health costs, but also in police, courts, prisons, all these kind of things, because what the data shows is that it would dramatically reduce the need for those kind of things as we expand these mind-body practices through public education throughout the whole planet. And so literally we're talking about planetary transformation in as little as 12 years of formal education of students coming up, through where mind-body practices are a core part of education, where, like for 1 hour a day, they would be practicing mind-body practices, every day for 12 years. And, they would literally graduate mind-body masters by the time they graduated high school.
Well, so you got me hooked, Bill, because I've been an educator for 13 years in public schools, private schools, inner city schools, nice suburb areas. And man, you are so right on. That is what we need. These kids are still playing kickball for the PE that we've been doing for 75 years instead of, Tai Chi, yoga, mind body. So, I mean, that is like an amazing proposal, but let's get, real, because we also know that junk food isn't good for kids, yet they continue to have the vending machines in the school with soda pop, chips. They sell crap, in the cafeterias. Yep. So in my opinion, and this is a whole nother topic, but I'm just going to put it out there, is that unless we get a voucher program where kids are, where parents are given the money and can choose where their kids are going to go to school, we're not going to get any competition with the public schools. And it's just going to continue on the same way it has. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, my biggest concern with the vouchers is that if it doesn't cover 100% of the education, then essentially what you're going to have is you're going to have a stratified society broken down by wealth, and so you'll have a massive number of kids who won't have access to good educations because they won't be able to pay the extra. If they developed a system where it completely covered 100% of the cost, then I think it would be a viable option. But I mean, the way that I look at this is that what I do is, anytime I get an opportunity to bend people's ear, through presentations or interviews or whatever, what I always point out is that it's insane that mind-body practices aren't part of public education. I mean, the science is in on this stuff. So I think, one of the things that we need to do is we just need to keep pointing out that it is insane that public education doesn't include mind-body practices. Because if we're trying to educate students, it all starts in, the mechanics of their brain, and the science is in on this stuff. We know that we can create better students. So, instead of a school spending a bunch of money on some, computer program or some gadget that they think will help students, it'll be much cheaper and much more effective to be teaching them mind-body practices, and it would, dramatically improve the quality of their education. So, I mean, I think, what we need to do is we just need to keep pointing out to educators and to education organizations that it's insane that these things aren't part of public education. I feel like if we just keep saying science and the obvious out loud enough times, then eventually it'll start to have an impact on the system. And there's a lot of educators that are involved in this stuff already. There's a public school system in Baltimore, and they got rid of their detention room and they turned it into a meditation room. And since they've done that, the scholastic scores of the whole school have gone up. The behavior rates have improved dramatically. Much less bullying. All these kind of things. So it's not really some strange thing that we have to sell education on. It's like the most practical thing in the world if you look at the science on it.
Now, I was curious what kind of response you've gotten from individuals in the community, especially in the scientific fields, because when I was doing my work on physics and biology, what I found in the academic communities is that there was this very strong bias against what I would describe as the intuitive sciences, anything where they can't hook up an electrode to it and measure it. And there was actually a friend of mine who was doing a research study, and it was in neurobiology. She was very excited. And when they were planning the research project, the leaders of the project said, now we are not going to use the word consciousness in this study. And she was so devastated because that was exactly what she was wanting to study, is consciousness, whether you call that spirituality or the metaphysics of it, like what's beyond all of the physical neurobiology of the brain and the body, and what makes us who we are. And so, I found there was this definite bias against a lot of that. And so, a lot of that goes back to this separation between what they call the hard sciences and the soft sciences. And, even psychology at one time was considered a pseudoscience. And so, we've had to make a lot of strides to legitimize what it is that we're doing. And so could you speak a little bit about, maybe some of the biases that you've encountered over the years? How have you seen that changed, and what has caused that change?
Yeah, well, I think what has caused some of the change is just the endlessly overwhelming amount of science that proves, the effect that mind-body practices have, on many different levels. And so I think that, just the mounting science is building a bigger and bigger wave. But, absolutely, there's been I call it science fundamentalists, where they think that everything that is known, that can be known, is already known. And of course, any real scientist would, admit that that's ridiculous. We only understand a tiny little percentage of the universe. And, consciousness is one of those things. And it's so bizarre, that they wouldn't want to use the word consciousness, because consciousness is a scientific fact. I just saw, if you go on YouTube and do a search for the Institute of Noetic Sciences, there's a fairly recent production that they put up there. And what they did was since the discovery of the double slit experiment in quantum physics, for those who might not be familiar with it, essentially what they did was they shot particles out of a laser through two slits in a barrier, and then behind that was a detecting screen that would detect where the subatomic particles struck. And what they found was that when they were looking at the particles going through the slits, they formed two slits on the barrier behind, because the particles were just going through the two slits. And of course, it ended up forming, two slit-like images on, behind. But what they found was that when they weren't looking at the particles going through the slits, the particles behaved like waves going through the slits. And so what that meant was they had a whole bunch of bars on the back that were less defined, because the particles were turning into waves, and they were flowing through in wave patterns that created those many things. Now, since that was discovered, there's a lot of mathematicians and scientists, physicists, that tried to discount this. They said, oh, it doesn't have anything to do with human consciousness. It's just the way that it's measured electronically and all this kind of stuff. So the Institute of Noetic Sciences, Dean Radin, he did a really fascinating study. And what they did was they had somebody sit within like 3 meters of the laser shooting the particles through the slits. And what they did was they had that person for 30 seconds envisioning the particles going through the slits, and then resting for 30 seconds, just letting their mind just rest for 30 seconds. And what they found was that there was a correlation when the meditators were envisioning the particles going through the slits. The particles behaved more like particles instead of waves. When the meditator's consciousness was resting, then they were being unobserved, and they went through and they became wave patterns again. And and they did this. They did hundreds of experiments with different people, different people doing it many times, and they found a very significantly measurable increase in the particle behavior of the particles when the human consciousness was envisioning the particles going through. So what that means is that human consciousness affects physical reality. So you can see how crazy it would be for anybody that's really interested in science to just completely eliminate consciousness. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's one of my favorite experiments, is that double slit experiment. And
yeah,
they've gone on to do that with a number of different particles. I think they started doing it with electrons first, and now they've gone on to do it with protons and neutrons, just all kinds of different particles. And so it really gives a lot of foundation to this idea that mystics and metaphysicians have been talking about for hundreds of years, that we are all beings of energy. And even, in some of the religious works, they talk about that you are light. And,
right.
It's like, that is the foundation really of what physics, and quantum physics in particular, is showing, is that we are energy, and that we coalesce into these patterns that appear to be particles, and these particles interact with each other. But whenever you're touching another object, it's really just the fields of those particles that are interacting with each other. You're not really touching anything, so to speak. And so it just really, it's one of those things that's like, fact is stranger than fiction. It's like the way that we perceive our world is so different than the reality of what it is. It's just mind blowing. That's why I'm just always so fascinated by this, and I just don't get enough of it. It's something I could do with the rest of my life.
Oh yeah, I hear you. Well, that's what's kept me going for these 3 decades collecting this science. And one of the things that I get into in the book that I think you'd find fascinating is I get into quantum entanglement, because you were talking about how the prophets. I talk a lot about the prophets of the major religions, and how they were painting these images that seemed kind of intangible and ethereal and all that kind of stuff. But now we're starting to see that there's a very physical reality to it. In Christian, in all the major religions' teaching, there's this laser focus on compassion and treating others with compassion. And that's true of all the major religions and the original prophets. And in fact, like in Christianity, for example, it went so far as to say that when you hurt other people, you're hurting me. You're hurting the divine. And then in the Quran, there's a line that says that when you do acts of kindness to other people, that you're actually being kind to yourself. And one of the things that I get into in the Gospel of Science is the DNA research. There's some very fascinating DNA research. I'll get back to the quantum entanglement in a moment. But what we realize when we start to look at these things is that the universe is fractal, which means self-replicating realities throughout all of existence. And so, for example, when they look at the DNA, one of the things that they found was that when people were engaged in hedonistic, selfish pleasures, they got a certain feeling of elation, kind of a high from it. But also when people were involved in altruistic endeavors, benefiting other people with no personal reward, they also got a certain high from that. Now, the highs that people got were very similar. So, when they just, the selfish pleasure people and the altruistic pleasure people, they both described the same kind of euphoria or kind of a high from it. But the DNA knew the difference. So the DNA, when people were involved in hedonistic, selfish pleasures, the health expression of the DNA degraded. There was more inflammation, for example, in their body. But for the people that were practicing altruistic pleasures, helping others, it actually improved the health of the DNA. It reduced the incidence of inflammation and things like this. And so what that showed was that the very core of our physical structure, compassion is just an integral part of who we are, as living beings. And so the ancient prophets of all the major religions, they were trying to extol this idea that compassion is the solution to everything. And now what we're finding, with the DNA research is that's true on a personal level. But as I go through the book, what I show this is that this fractal reality of compassion being at the core of everything is reflected throughout all levels of our life, including our economy personally and also on a macroeconomic scale. And one of the things that I point to early on in the book is in a chapter called "Let's Get Practical." There's in Utah and in Florida, they adopted a new approach to dealing with homelessness. And what they did was they started giving apartments to homeless people. And what they found, and this runs counter to the way that we've been brought up to think of how the world works, kind of a zero-sum game where if one person wins, the other person loses. This blows all that away. And it really shows that the prophets were onto some kind of high science when they were extolling empathy and compassion. Because in Florida and Utah, what they found was that when they gave apartments to homeless people, they saved between $11,000 and $21,000 per homeless person on saved emergency room, police, courts, all the social costs that you have associated with homelessness. So it was actually a money-making endeavor for those cities or states to house their homeless. They were saving between $11,000 and $21,000 per person by doing the compassionate thing, which is providing a homeless person with an apartment to live in, to get out of the rain and get out of the danger of the night, and so on and so forth. And as I go through the book, I expand this to macroeconomics. If you look through the history of our macroeconomics in the United States, for example, and also throughout the world, what you find is that compassion is the core of a vibrant, healthy economy. And when selfishness and greed take over, then that's when you're headed for economic collapse. And so this carries through. So this reality that we have in our basic foundational DNA structure of empathy and compassion being, solving our personal problems as well as our social problems, that also is true in macroeconomics and through all levels of society. And now quantum entanglement, I wanted to mention, that's how I started on this. So there's one of the things that spurred me kind of in the beginning to start putting this book together in an official or in a formal way was a couple of things. One is that I noticed in my classes that students were having the same experience that I had. And that is that as we practice mind-body practices, we became easier to get along with. And I had an ER physician in one of my classes, and he said, "Man, I'm not getting this energy work, this meditation stuff. We do Neigong meditation in my classes." And he goes, I don't get it. I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. I don't know what. And then the next week I went to give him his next lesson, and because I was giving him private lessons at his home. And he said, I think I'm starting to understand about what this meditation stuff's about. And I said, "Oh, really, John?" I said, what happened?" And he said, this week in my ER staff told me, "Man, we don't know what you've been doing, John, but you were way easier to get along with than you used to be. So keep doing it." And
that's awesome.
Yeah, and then I got invited. I had just a couple years before I'd released the Complete Idiot's Guide to Tai Chi and Qigong that me and my wife wrote, and so I got invited to do a presentation at Folsom Maximum Security Prison in California. And I didn't realize it at the time, but they had actually already had a Tai Chi Cha, like a Qigong meditation program going for 2 years before I got there. And one of the inmates was like an assistant teacher, and he'd been looking at the prison statistics while they'd had the program for 2 years. And what they found was that not only did the behavior rates change for the inmates that were in the Tai Chi Cha program, but they improved for the entire prison. And you see this through other research and other studies. There was a prison in Mexico had the same effect when they started teaching some of the staff and some of the inmates how to do meditation. Their violent incident rates went way down, and then TM Foundation did a fascinating study with the Washington, D.C. Police Department, and they were able to bring the homicide, rapes, and assaults, the violent crime rates, down by over 25% during the high crime season. And so what I started to see was that these changes that happen in our consciousness, they don't just happen with us and the people that we physically interact with. This change in consciousness ripples out into the larger world. And so, as I've been trying to understand, how can things be connected like this, I came across, quantum entanglement. And what quantum entanglement is what they found is that if two particles were connected within an atom at any time in history, they were connected forever. And so what that meant was that if one particle changed its spin, the other particle would change its spin in the opposite direction at precisely the same instant. Even if those particles were on opposite sides of the universe, they would still respond that way. Now, the Tai Chi symbol, most people call it the yin yang symbol, but it's, the official name for it in Taoism is the Tai Chi symbol. And that's a symbol for unification, like yoga. Like yoga is a symbol for unification. And what it represents is the universe right before the Big Bang. Now, right before the Big Bang, the whole universe, the whole physical universe that we know of, it was smaller, it was so much smaller than the head of a pin. It's like you couldn't even see how small it was. And then it unfolded into the yin and the yang, or the positive and negative polarities of the universe.
All right, Bill, we're going to have to stick a pin in it right there for just a moment. We're going to take a short break, but let's pick up with that thought about the Tai Chi symbol and the yin yang when we get back from the break. This is Spirit's Journey on Truth Frequency Radio, Oneness Talk Radio. See you on the other side. Welcome back from the break. If you're just joining us, this is Spirit's Journey with Patrick and Catherine Andrews, coming to you from Truth Frequency Radio, Oneness Talk Radio, among others. We are here today with Bill Douglas, who is an award-winning author of The Gospel of Science, as well as the founder of World Tai Chi Day. So welcome back, Bill. And we were just talking about quantum entanglement right before the break. So did you have more to share with us about that?
Yeah. So the kind of the wrap up on that I was mentioning is the Tai Chi symbol represents the moment before the Big Bang, when the universe expanded. And so at that point before the Big Bang, the universe was so infinitesimally small that everything was entangled. And so now we understand that, through quantum entanglement, that things on opposite sides of the universe are connected in such a way that they can affect each other instantaneously. And so my experience with the Folsom Prison Project, and then also, what I've read about, other similar research, is that when human consciousness is changed by, when it finds a new coherence through meditation, through the practice of alpha state, brainwave producing mind-body practices, like all the ones that we're familiar with, Tai Chi, Qigong, yoga, different kinds of meditation, repetitive prayer, these different kinds of things, they bring the brain into the alpha state. And when we go into that alpha state, you had mentioned the particle and wave aspect of subatomic physics, and what I've the way that I've come to see it in my own life and in my own practice is when we go into that alpha state where the mind is just kind of drifting, it's not thinking in linear logical terms, it's just kind of unhinged and drifting when we get to that alpha state for a few moments. And I think what it is when we're in beta brainwave or busy brainwave state, which is where most people are, all the time. It's like, we see ourselves as a single thing, like a particle. But when we go into that alpha state, it's like we unhinge and we become part of the field. It's like we go into that wave state where we're connected to everything. And then that facilitates, this consciousness expanding out, through, all of civilization. So the, the premise of my book is, if we get mind-body practices as a core part of public education worldwide, we could profoundly change, every aspect of humanity and the human condition, in profoundly positive ways that would save trillions and trillions of dollars. And I lay all this out factually in the book so that you can see this all with a science-based case. And so we're talking about planetary transformation that would not even require the whole planet to be practicing these things. Just a significant percentage of the planet would have a dramatic effect on the behavior and the consciousness and the mental and emotional and physical health of the whole planet.
And so, Bill, I wanted to ask, I'm fascinated by the connection between compassion and changing the world. And one of the questions I have is, why do you think that we, or so many people, have lost that compassion? I mean, I know it's not specifically taught in schools, and myself, I think that technology has a lot to do with it, that we are interfacing with computers instead of people. And so, it's like we're losing that human touch. But I'm just curious what you would say. Why is there less compassion, does it seem?
Yeah, well, I actually get into all this in great detail in the book, because one of the things that I, point out that I've observed, after 64 years on this planet, is that self-fulfilling prophecy is the most profound form of prophecy. Because through the science, I paint a picture in the book how obvious it is that everything, virtually everything in modern society is the product of a human consciousness. Every bridge, every school, everything that we see, it was originally a spark of consciousness inside somebody's mind, that eventually was handed to an engineer or whatever it was that, made it so. And so the way that we see ourselves in the world and see our future is a real powerful part of the self-fulfilling prophecy of where we will be in the future as a society. It's like we're creating reality as we dream it, especially in an age when, thoughts can move through the internet at, virtually at the speed of light. And so one thing that I, in my, because I teach mind-body, I teach stress management. That's really the focus of what I teach when I go into a corporation or a school or whatever, is I'm teaching stress management. And so one of the things that I started talking to people about when I became aware of it was that the planet Earth is actually vastly less violent than it has ever been before in human history. And I know that's shocking to most people, because the media gives us the impression that things are just going to hell in a handbasket, and which is not a good thing, because it's not true. And because it's not true, it distorts the way that we're moving into our future. And in the book, I recommend a book that kind of led me in this direction, by Steven Pinker. He's a Harvard social psychologist that wrote a book called The Better Angels of Our Nature. And he meticulously goes through the history of humanity, and he shows you, as you go through the book, you realize that it's an absolute fact that the planet Earth is vastly less violent than at any time before in human history. And violent crime rates are going down in the United States and in many countries around the world. And in fact, right now, violent crime rates in the United States are hitting like 30-year lows. Now, most people don't know that, because the media never mentions that. They always they'll tell you that the crime rates are going up. What they don't tell you is that even though they've gone up a little bit, they're still vastly lower than they were 30 years ago. And I think that the spread of these mind-body practices throughout the planet is playing a role in this, because in my book, I quote a sociologist from, I think it's New York City College, NYCC. And anyway, he says nobody knows why violent crime rates are going down in much of the planet. Because, some people say, oh, it's because of policing, or it's because of this or because of that. But he points out nobody really understands it, because different cities are not using the same systems, but yet violent crime is going on all over the planet, going down all over the planet. And so by expanding these practices into public education, we can expedite this. Something that's already happening on a massive scale can be happening at a much greater pace that would, transform the planet. I mean, we'd be talking less war, less conflict. And right now, the world is spending so much money on military. The United States right now, we're spending 61 cents on every discretionary tax dollar on military spending. And so that's a huge deal. Dr. Martin Luther King, I quote him in the book. He said that a nation that year after year continues to spend more on military than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. And so the thing is well, kind of getting back to the original point that started us on this was, why are people losing touch with their humanity? This compassion, which is such a core part of humanity, and they're not. Actually, if you look at the public opinion polls, what you find is that the average person in the country is extremely empathetic and compassionate, and they want solutions that will benefit everybody. So they don't just want healthcare for themselves. The overwhelming majority of people, they want every man, woman, and child to have access to healthcare, and that's reflected in the public opinion polls. So there's a schism. There's like a media world, kind of an official political party media world that tells us one thing. But the world that we live in, if you look at the public opinion polls, people are very empathetic and they're very compassionate. So it's really just the opposite. We haven't lost touch. We're becoming more in touch with our humanity. It's not breaking through this schism and this barrier of popular media culture. And popular media culture, they make money off of fear. When people are afraid, they're more likely to tune in. It's almost like they say, the end of the world is coming. Make sure you tune in after this commercial so we can tell you, what's going to happen. And so we get a distorted image when we look at the media, but if we look at the reality and look at the facts, and that's what I've tried to do with this book, is to provide all this data to just transform the way that we see the possibilities of the future. And in that way, we create a self-fulfilling prophecy that is extraordinarily hopeful, beyond imagination. And again, if people read the book and they look at the science, and I've meticulously cited all the science, the articles or the scientific studies or whatever I refer to in the book is cited in the back. So you can go to the original studies or the original article or whatever and prove to yourself that the future is tremendously hopeful, tremendously hopeful.
That's very uplifting. And I think you bring up some great points, Bill, about the media. And we've seen the extreme damage they've been causing with the whole coronavirus misinformation, now with the political thing going on. And more people, what we've done is, I have to watch alternative media. I cannot watch the mainstream media anymore. And I think along with that is people want the truth, and they're smelling that it's really fishy what's coming off the other channels. And it's I wonder if those reporters really realize how much damage they're doing to people, because reporting isn't even taking place anymore. They're just reading off a script. And I think they're looking at, oh, this is my paycheck, I'm going to read this script. And if they understood how thoughts create reality and how so many people are being sucked in by what they say, I think they'd be horrified, honestly.
Yeah, there's chapters in this book that in the Gospel of Science that I think you'll really be attracted to, because I get into all this stuff. And, and I talk about the schism and why is this schism happening. And one of the things that some of the science that I get into in the book, I have a chapter called Golden Calves, not evil, just distractions. And, because everybody who went to madrasa school or to Hebrew school or to Bible school or whatever, we were all raised. These three religions have so much in common. It's literally crazy that we think that we're so different, because we all come right out of the same roots, and we all had the same stories when we were going to religious training. And one of the things was the golden calf, where they were worshiping the golden calf. And so I titled the chapter with that, because one of the things that modern society has done is it's kind of made money a god, kind of. And so some of the science that I get into, because I open that chapter with a quote from the Bible and also a quote from the Quran, and both of them warn us about the dangers of wealth. They don't say that wealth is bad or evil or any of that kind of stuff. It just warns us that we can be distracted by it. And so some of the science that I have in that chapter is that what they're finding is that it's, and I don't want to put a blanket thing on anybody, because everybody's, there's no blanket way to describe everybody. Everybody's, everybody approaches everything in their own way. But what you do find is that people that have extreme wealth have a tendency to be less empathetic and less able to have meaningful relationships with other people where they can work things out. Because they're kind of used to having things their own way, I presume, is the reason it comes out this way. And so one of the problems that we have with mainstream media is that it's all, and I get into this, I can't remember if it's in that chapter or in other chapters, but the problem is Howard Zinn has a great book, Noam Chomsky had a great book called The Manufacturing of Consent. And what he showed was that there's just a very tiny handful of corporations that own virtually all the media in most of the world. So almost everything that we read, hear, or see comes from about 5 or 6 memos in these corporations. And so the problem is we have multi-billionaires that are giving scripts to multi-millionaires, that have shiny teeth and perfect hair that we see on the TV screens. And so what's happening is we're not getting the whole picture because of this breakdown in the consciousness, where there's very little room on mainstream media for the empathy, because it's lacking in the system that we've set up. So more and more people are, and I get into this in the book, that more and more people are turning to alternative media because they have a hunger for truth. They need truth. They need it just like oxygen. And so they're hunting for it. They're searching for it everywhere that they can. And so that is something that needs to be dealt with, because if we're not getting a realistic picture from the media, then how can we make rational decisions? So even though the society at large is very compassionate, if you look at the public opinion polls, it's not being transferred into the picture that the media paints of the world, and it's not being painted in the picture that the political parties are painting for the world. And so we're going through a huge change right now. And in Chinese, the character for crisis in Chinese is a combination of 2 characters. One is danger and the other one is opportunity. So there's a lot of dangers coming up because things are kind of falling apart in some ways. Old structures that don't work are falling apart, but there's a tremendous opportunity, as people are, going out and, hungering for truth and searching for new information, to feed their soul. And I quote Walt Whitman in this. He says that, go back over every book and everything that you've ever read or been exposed to, and reject what insults your soul, and absorb what it is that resonates with your soul. And so I think that's kind of where people are at right now.
Well, I've been exploring that same dynamic that you're describing of these mega titans of these corporations. And I would even go further to say this, not even just the media corporations, but it's also the heads of the technology groups too, like Google and Facebook. And they're discovering that they have this ability to manipulate society by manipulating their algorithms. And so I've started tracking this since about the end of 2018. And, they're censoring people that are saying things that go against the theme of what they want to produce. And they claim it's people violating their community standards. And yet, when we're looking into these people who are actually being censored and their accounts being canceled, things like that, they're talking about things like natural health. So,
I know.
There's definitely this agenda that they are pushing here. And, they're starting to try to manipulate the beliefs and things of the people. Although, like we've been talking about, it's really interesting because they're actually creating the opposite effect. There's this backlash, like you're describing. People hunger for the truth. And I think that either intuitively or just because, people are more perceptive than they give them credit for. People know something is fishy. And so they dig deeper. And there are people that I think just believe whatever comes along. I do see those people too, who's just like whatever's on TV, they believe it is the truth. But then there's this whole other group of people who are like, wait a minute, that doesn't seem right. And even people who early on seem to totally buy it, after about 6 months of this stuff, then they're like, you know, this just doesn't feel right. You know, something's
Yeah.
not
Yeah,
right here.
yeah, you can feel them like bending your consciousness to come to some preformed conclusion that they want you to arrive at, you know.
And it's interesting too, because when I was looking at this, I was realizing, okay, let's say you have $100 million. And so then you increase your wealth from 100 million to 200 million. Well, when we were
Mm,
talking about those endorphins earlier, it's like maybe your first 100 million, you're exhilarated. You're like, oh my gosh, I've made it. You know, it's like I have more money than I could ever spend in my lifetime. And then when you
mm,
double that, you're like, you know, what's another 100 million? You know, I can't even spend that much money. So I'm realizing that like the only way that these huge wealthy corporate owners can release more endorphins is by control. It's power. You know, when
yeah.
they can exert power over other people, and then the
Mhm,
more people, they're like, oh yeah, I'm influencing 100 million people. You know,
mhm,
that gets exciting, and it's this whole separation between spirituality and the physical world, like the physical world and the spiritual world, where they look at the world as just physical. It's like, okay,
mhm.
I can just do whatever I want without any consequences, you know, because it's, you know, a misinterpretation of Darwin's law, the survival of the fittest, you know,
Mhm.
which a lot of people misinterpret that, and they think, oh, the strongest is going to win. So I've got to be the alpha and I've got to control everything.
Yeah,
And that's Darwin's law. Well, Darwin was talking about the most fit in that circumstance. So the fittest individual or species might be the smartest, you know,
mhm,
and sometimes it's the one that goes and hides instead of fights. You know, there's all
mhm.
kinds of different scenarios where a particular species is the most fit for that environment. So it's
Yeah.
not always the strongest, you know. And
Mhm.
so I'm curious what your take is, because you talk about that there is no separation between the physical and the spiritual. We talked about quantum entanglement before, so that's kind of where physics is starting to reinforce that. A lot of mystics have always talked about for thousands of years that we're all one. And
Mhm.
so that seems to really kind of go along with your idea that there is no separation between the physical and the spiritual. So if you could talk about that just a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. You know, I mean, we, you know, in a quantum physics world, you know, we're energy. You know, we're a little more than holograms, really. I mean, we're mostly empty space, and we're, you know, part of a field of energy. You know, where everything is connected. And there was something that you were talking about right at the very end of your question that I was going to key off on. Do you remember what it was you were saying? There was something.
Well, was it talking about power and how like they
Yeah,
weren't getting it like an endorphin hit off the money anymore, so then they had to turn to power?
yeah, yeah. There was something.
I
Yeah,
like to think of it as the idea that so we're spiritual beings having a physical experience.
yes,
And so that I think kind of encapsulates this idea that there is no, it's like putting a fish
yeah,
in water. We are the
hmm,
fish in the water, so we're all together. There really is no separation. It's just a different experience.
yeah, yeah. And the, you know, and all the, you know, the original prophets. It was like, you know, it was like the more I've explored, you know, all the science in this book, I've come to realize that those people were kind of like high scientists, you know, because we tend to think of them as like, you know, poetic orators. You know, they had really, you know, nice ideas, but it was kind of like, you know, not really practical in the practical world. But what all this science is showing is that, you know, when, you know, Muhammad and Buddha and Jesus and, you know, the Hebrew prophets, you know, when all these people were extolling us to, you know, to have compassion for everybody, you know, not just some people, but everybody, they were operating at this high science level, you know, that showed that that is the most effective and efficient way to, you know, deal with the lives that we're living in. And man, I wish I could remember what it was you were talking about right before, you know, right when you were formulating that question, because it went right to the heart of something that I really expand on in this book.
Well, one area that I would like to ask you about, Bill, is you talk about the pineal gland in the skull being heralded
Yes.
throughout millennia as the portal to transformation. And so, you know, in our meditations, we've worked a little bit with the pineal gland, but I would love to know, you know, what it is about the pineal gland that's significant.
Yeah. Well, what my own journey has shown me is that Rene Descartes called the pineal gland the seat of the human soul. And so through my own journey of meditation and studying my own consciousness and then trying to teach it to others, what I've realized is that pineal gland right in the center of the brain, the center of our consciousness, right in the center of the brain, that's a switch, and that's where we switch from being a particle to becoming a wave. Where we become part of the field consciousness of everything, because when we're in left brain thinking, when we're in focused word thought, where most people are all the time, that's when the pineal gland is in the control mode. Where we're thinking in words, we're thinking in a controlled thought pattern. But when we go into alpha state, when we let the mind sigh, let that very center of the brain sigh and let go and just kind of drift and get lost, in those drifts of consciousness where we're not thinking in words, we're like pure consciousness, we're having an experience, but we're not thinking about the experience. That's when the pineal gland switches off. It switches off, and then we become that wave and we become connected to everything on that consciousness level. And so that pineal gland, I get into this in the book, where that's like that core place where we flip that switch. And then when we flip that switch, then we're open to feel the consciousness. And this is the place, where, the prophets of the religions and Einstein and Nikola Tesla, and these great thinkers that, offered these huge breakthroughs in the history of humanity. That's where it came from. It came from them drifting into that alpha state. And in the book, I talk about Albert Einstein. He said that Mozart's music was so exquisitely beautiful. He said that he didn't believe that Mozart wrote it. He believed that it existed in the fabric of the universe, and that what Mozart did was that he opened to that vibratory rate. And then his mind was able to, become an effective receiver for that music, and then he was able to write it down so that people could reproduce it. and I get into this in the book, that it's this open state of consciousness. That is where all that's where all innovation comes from. All paradigm shifts in the way that we see everything comes out of going into this alpha state consciousness. And then it also produces what scientists now call gamma wave consciousness, or it's also called integrative thinking, where all the facts, all the disparate facts and everything that we've been exposed to come together and form these elegant, higher, more sophisticated ways of approaching issues and problems in the world. And so if we train a whole generation in mind-body practices in public school, we'll have a whole generation of these higher thinkers that can go into these realms of the Mozarts and of the Einsteins and of the Teslas and of the Buddhas and the Jesuses and the Mohammeds, and be able to see these larger perceptions of the possibility of reality. And I think it was in Proverbs that said, where there is no vision.
Bill, actually, we're going to have to pause right there. Maybe save that for another conversation, because we are out of time for right now. So thank you so much for joining us today. And we look forward to reconnecting sometime so that we can continue the discussion, because obviously it sounds like we have more to discuss. So this has been Spirit's Journey on Truth Frequency Radio and Oneness Talk Radio. I'm Patrick.
I'm Catherine. So get out there and do some meditation and mind-body exercises, everyone.
Goodbye for now.